Cool. Yes.
Okay, 3, 2, 1. Good morning, everyone. For the ones watching at home, one watching anywhere around the world, good evening, good night, good afternoon. You are gathered here today to see an interview between two people. My name is Yashb Gunaeskar. I'm a pianist and composer who's a recent KM alumni. And I have a special guest with me by the name of Utsyo Chakraborty, who's also a composer pianist from Kolkata. Thank you for meeting me, Utsyo Chakraborty, and let's have a great time together.
I hope to have a great time with you, Yashab.
Okay, so without any further ado, let's begin. So,
Mhm.
introduce yourself to the rest of the world. Who is Utsyo Chakraborty, and what's your occupation, and how has it been?
So I am a composer and a pianist, and I've been doing this. I've been playing the piano for almost 16 years. That's a long time. And I guess I've been composing for a little lesser than that, for about 12 years, I guess. And I have an associate's degree in piano performance from the Trinity College of London, but I am a self-taught composer. But I've had some good instruction from some composer colleagues abroad in the US and in UK. And basically, by training, I am a statistician. I did my master's in statistics from the Indian Statistical Institute, and I'm currently working as a data scientist. But composing is something I've always loved doing ever since I was a little child. And so here I am speaking to you, the wonderful pianist and composer.
Okay, that's very nice. Okay, so where did your interest in Western classical music come from? What's the first thing that piqued your interest?
I think to understand that, it's best to know a little about my upbringing because I think that has had a huge role to play. So I come from a liberal, highly educated, middle class Bengali family. So, one of the things which sort of defines the straight up society, our society in Bengal, is that besides your usual academics in school, you have to mandatorily do or pursue an extracurricular activity as a hobby.
Mhm.
So my parents are not musicians, but they're quite musical. They do like good music and they have respect for musicians. And so my older brother started playing the piano, and I have an older brother. So he started playing the piano, and I just started observing what he was doing. And I think my mom told this to me that I was like clapping along with the rhythms that he was playing, of the pieces that he was playing with perfect accuracy. And his piano teacher somehow noticed that. And he thought that I might have some musical potential of some sort. And so he recommended me to start lessons. And turns out that I was pretty good at it. And so therefore I started playing the piano. And composing was something else because I remember the day, like I was about 4.5 years old or 5 years old when my brother got a score, a piece of sheet music. And when I saw that, I was utterly fascinated to see these drawings, and I got to know them much later on that they are pitches and rhythms and rests and dynamics and pedal marks, etc. But for a 4.5-year-old, imagine the effect that that has. For me, it was like looking at a treasure map, and if you like decode the map, you're going to come to your secret treasure. And I guess in hindsight, the secret treasure was a good performance. But that got me going. And so I remember that there was a blank sheet of, manuscript paper on the side, and I started scribbling something. I was 5 years old. That was not composing. That was just sort of fun. But then, I seriously started composing. I wrote my first piece when I was 8.5. And then I started writing, pieces in the style of, say, Beethoven, Chopin, Mozart, childish imitations of that. But, at age 11, I discovered Stravinsky. And that was very different from anything I'd ever heard in my life. I listened to Le Sacre du Printemps, which is the Rite of Spring. And I think it was Pierre Boulez who was conducting. And, when I heard that performance, I was so bowled over by it because I'd never heard anything like it. And it had such a visceral reaction to, I had such a visceral reaction to it that it sort of opened the doors to contemporary music to me. And that was what my that's what my experience with classical music has been since then. And it has continuously evolved in a very different direction. And there is the saying that whatever you listen to in your tween and teenage years sort of stays with you all your life. And that's sort of been very true for me.
Hmm, that's nice. So you mentioned that you're a self-taught composer. So in your opinion,
Yes.
what do you think is the difference between learning music yourself in composition in comparison to
Yeah.
people learning composition at universities, and how did you find yourself as a composer within this process?
Okay, that's an interesting question. I think I think one of the natural presumptions that you have in your question is that composers who study at universities can find their voices easier than composers who don't. I don't agree with that actually. I think uh, a university can perhaps teach you the tools and the techniques in a sort of an organized manner. And I'm of course not denying that it's very important to have education to develop your skills and to hone your technique and talent. Of course, that's necessary. But ultimately, to find your own voice, it's up to you. I think you are the person, the onus is on you to discover yourself. And I discovered that through composing. So people might have noticed that I'm quite prolific, but it's not to show off to the world that look at my compositional chops, I can write so many kinds of music. No, it's actually I compose a lot because I view it as learning, and I can I learn from what I write. And so I can give you an example. So when I started writing, I wrote pieces in the style of Chopin and Schumann, as I said. They were no good. But when I listened to Stravinsky for the first time, he opened the doors to 20th century music. And that meant that I started listening to Debussy, Ravel, to Barres, to so many, Schoenberg, Webern, Berg, etc. And I was fascinated by that. And so I always loved French music. So my next pieces were sort of Ravelian, impressionistic pieces when I was 15. Then I went to minimalism. I was influenced by Steve Reich and John Adams and Philip Glass. But I soon discovered that it was quite uninteresting for me, so I never wrote anything minimalist after that. And then I discovered John Cage and his chance music. And that was an interesting experience because I had a lot of fun writing these chance-based pieces. But very quickly, I realized that John Cage might have been a great philosopher, but his ideas involved abdicating the composer's soul from the music. And that put me in a crisis because I had lost control over what I was writing. So that meant that when I turned into an adult at 18, I had to start all over again. And so therefore, I discovered the 12-tone system, the serial system. I started listening to Schoenberg, Berg, Webern, and at the same time, Boulez and Berio and other composers. And what I found fascinating about that system, was that it provided me a framework, if I would say, to sort of be coherent on a basis of harmony and rhythms, but at the same time have scope for imagination and for spontaneity. And since then, I have been sort of developing my own language, which is vaguely based on the serial system, although much more flexible. And I am not afraid of, bringing in those good old tonal influences in my music. And so that's how I found myself, through trial and error and through a constant belief that I have to achieve what I want to achieve.
Yes. This is actually a question I just thought out in my mind, where you spoke a lot of influences that you started with Schumann, Chopin, and a lot of romantic era composers. Is it
Yeah,
fine if
yeah.
you would give a little bit of a journey of what did you start composing when you started with Schumann, and some of the romantic era influences of how you actually began that, because they were your
Oh,
works almost. So
yeah. I think my earliest pieces, they were nocturnes and polonaises. So you know that's Chopin influence. And I remember I would love Schumann's Papillon, Opus 2. And what really struck me about that piece, it's actually nothing but waltzes and mazurkas, right? But what fascinated me back then, and it's still a fascination to me right now, because so many contemporary composers have that issue, was how Schumann wrote 11 or 12 of these dangling bits and pieces and merged them together in a coherent form. So that was the sort of, and then so when I started listening to Debussy, which is the later Debussy, like pieces like Je or the Etudes, for example, I found that Debussy had the same thing, because from what I know about Je, which is an orchestral piece Debussy wrote around 1913, the piece has around 60 sections in 20 minutes, one after the other, and they're also like Schumann in a way, dangling bits and pieces, but every single thing connects to one another in a sort of a coherent manner. Stockhausen called this moment form. And that was always very interesting to me. And, in a way, the old compositional practices, like even the Romantic period, especially Schumann, it still informs my compositional practice today after almost 11 or 12 years.
that's very nice. You have composed a new piece called as the Piano Fantasy, and you have commissioned to me personally. And as I notice it, there's a lot of combination of old and new, combining the Baroque era and modernist techniques. So would you
Mhm.
explain, and is it fine if you would go through what have you explored in this piece of music, and how did your style evolve in that particular piece of music?
Yeah, that's so. Before, so just for the record, I'll say that you commissioned me to write a piano piece, medium size in duration, and you gave me a constraint that it has to be somewhat of a Baroque style piece. It has to be a prelude and a fugue. And when you said that to me, it set off a trail of thought in my head, for about 2 months. And for 2 months, I thought that it was a kind of a dual approach, because writing in a Baroque form, which was so predominant in the 16th and 17th centuries, or no, 17th and 18th centuries, and then writing in these forms in the 21st century. So that's a challenge. Several of the neoclassical composers like say Hindemith and Martinu, they wrote pieces like this. But I wanted to do something different. I did not want to write refrigerated Bach or refrigerated tonal music in any way. I didn't want to do it, as Bernstein would have said. Um, so that was an interesting challenge, the first thing. And the second thing which really struck me was that in preparing for your piece, I started listening to all the Bach fugues from the well-tempered clavier and from stoccatas and from the various keyboard and organ music, and even so from the musical offering. I started a sort of strict study of those pieces. And the thing I found out is that Bach's pieces really work beautifully because of their tonality.
Mm-hmm.
What is a fugue? In simple words, a fugue, for a non-technical audience, a fugue is actually a conversation among voices. And whatever one voice responds is somewhat related to what another person has said previous. But in order to sort of get that, in order to sort of understand that orally, if the music is tonal, then the differentiation between the voices becomes very clear. And that's why that leads to the success of the pieces. And in comparison, I heard a lot of fugues which were written in a non-tonal style. I will not name any composers, but the ultimate effect to me was like an undifferentiated blob of chromatic sludge. I didn't want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So that was another interesting thing. How to write music which is not refrigeratedly tonal, nor is it old in the traditional Bach or in the Hindemithian sense,
Mm-hmm.
nor is it, you can say, uh, looking back in any way. So that was an interesting challenge. So I started listening to the pieces of César Franck, his keyboard music, and I discovered that he wrote several lovely three-part pieces, triptychs, like the Prelude, Chorale, and Fugue, or Prelude, Fugue, Chorale, etc. And they were lovely pieces. And so I settled in a three-movement form for you, a prelude and a fugue and an aria at the end, as a sort of summarization of everything. And at the same time, I started re-listening to the night music of Bartok,
Mm-hmm.
like say in the Out of Door Suite, or say the Music for Strings Percussion Celeste, or say the Elegy movement of the Concerto for Orchestra. And so that made me come on a form which is a language which is neither tonal nor non-tonal. I actually view these schools as separate. Tonal music and non-tonal music are not alike. They try to do very different things.
Mm-hmm.
So I try to create a piece which neither accepts nor rejects tonality or non-tonality at the same time. So it's like a feeling that you're in both worlds at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the feeling. And that also matched with the dual idea of a Baroque form in the 21st century. And so it all fit together, and the piece came about very quickly. And one thing I would say that I really enjoyed writing this piece. It was a conceptual challenge, but I really enjoyed writing this for you.
That's nice. Okay, thank you. I am going to ask you one more question regarding the university style of composing and self-learning. Not exactly, but
Mhm.
to end this section off. And it's a question that actually came in my head. Would you
Mhm.
ever, at a point of time, imagine or ever think about applying to go to a music school and learning composition? Would you ever think about
Absol-
certain thing?
Absolutely. Why not? If the opportunity were to present itself, why not? Absolutely. I'm not against universities in any way. I think universities are a great way of disseminating knowledge in an organized manner. And so if I would have ever gotten the opportunity, some time to spend of my daily schedule, I would love to do it.
Mhm. Wow. Okay. Have you ever had a distinct memory of feeling othered in a classical music circle, especially of Western classical music in India, which is at this moment, it is a developing form of an industry which has still not established a huge reputation.
Mhm.
Have you ever felt
Uh,
feeling
hmm.
an outsider, like an outsider, honestly?
I would be lying if I say I didn't. I have felt as an outsider at times, but I felt an outsider in a very positive way.
Hmm.
That makes any sense to you. I'll give you an example. Uh, 2 years ago, I was commissioned by the Indian pianist Parvez Modi, who is a wonderful musician and who's settled in Germany. He wanted me to write a piece so that he can tour it in all the various cities of Germany in which he would be giving concerts on Indian themed programs, which would go along with the music of Sesorabji, John Pauls, and Scriabin.
Hmm.
And so I responded with a 9 movement, 20-minute piece for piano, which was called Nabrasa. And so I uploaded, and Nabrasa is based, as the name suggests, on the 9 emotions in the Indian performing arts. So what the piece was is that it has an effectively Indian basis, but it has a sort of an abstract way of looking at these emotions. I uploaded a mock version of this on YouTube, and it was quite successful, if I may say. And one of the comments that I received, which really touched me, was said that particular piece, Nabrasa, was one of the most interesting pieces of new music the commenter had heard in decades. And what fascinated him even more was that it came from India, which is not a center for Western music as of now, as you have rightly mentioned. And I'm going to say cliched words right now, but I'm going to say them because it's true. The world is a global village. I think communication has become so much easier. I can speak with anyone in the world at any instant of time, and I can talk about anything I want. I think gone are the days in which Indians have to write Indian music, um, Koreans have to write Korean music, Japanese people have to write Japanese music, Germans have to write German music. Gone are the days. I think nationalism in the old-fashioned sense is not here anymore. It's not here. And I think with the advent of technology, with ease of communication, and with intelligent people living all over the world, I think if you want to absorb, the influences from a variety of sources, you have very efficient ways of doing it. And that's what I have been doing. And despite my Indian background, I think my Indian background has sort of helped me stand out a bit, if I can say. I think it has attracted the attention of some performers in the US, especially because what they found was that, as you said, India is not a center of classical music, but yet they found that there was a vibrant young group of composers whom you and I both know, uh, who want to create a brand of music which Indian composers are writing. And so I have felt othered, but I have felt othered in a very positive
Hmm. Nice. So, of course, at this point of time, you have become a very esteemed composer within your circle. You have created a big community together. You have performers from the US, you have performers from all over the world, like commissioning your works.
way. Yeah.
So, what advice would you give to young South Asians about having a career in Western classical music?
Of course, this advice I'm going to give works for not South Asians in particular, but for anyone. I think we have to have perseverance. You have to be passionate in what you're doing. Of course, if you're not passionate in what you're doing, you would not be a musician. You have to persevere. You have to keep going. There are going to be bad days and good days, but you have to like keep yourself level-headed and go on. But there's one thing I would like to say to performance in this country, especially in India. The advice would be that please do not be satisfied by what you have, because if you're content, if you start treating your um, performance career, your composing career as a big cushion in which you can sit back and relax, it doesn't work that way. I think, especially for performers, when it comes to repertoire choice, I think it's not really true in Europe and America, where contemporary music is played and is patronized to a great extent. Not so much in India, perhaps because there's not been much exposure for contemporary music. So there is some suspicion of contemporary music in our country, which is lingering around in performing circles. One thing I would just say is that I can give an example yet again of Franz Liszt. Liszt was the preeminent performer in his day. And when Listomania was around, there were women and men of all shapes and sizes and nationalities who were flocking in from all parts of the world to see, get a glimpse of this charismatic performer.
Mhm.
But keeping that aside, what would Liszt play in his programs? Liszt would play the music of Schumann, Chopin, Schubert, Brahms, Wagner, Saint-Saëns, Rossini, Verdi, with Wagner. I could just go on. But what was that? That was the contemporary music of his day. And even he played his own music, which was great music. And you see, with taking Liszt as an example, I would say that if young, especially in India, if performers can have developed or exposed the audience to contemporary music, that would be a wonderful thing for their careers.
Mhm.
Because when I have heard, I've spoken to several performers and they say, but of course, but audiences don't like to listen to contemporary music. And to that, I will say that the audiences are much more receptive than you think they are.
Mm.
Much more receptive. So
Mm.
if you present contemporary music in a good setting, in a contextual setting, of course, you will be introducing them to a new experience. And especially to composers of South Asian countries, if you can find a composer or several composers from your country who you can champion and who you can be a voice for, there can be nothing better than that. And
Mm.
for composers, there aren't too many composers in our country, but there are a few. And they're all very talented and they're all very wonderful in their own way. We all write very different kinds of music. You know, I am more inclined towards modern music, modernist music. I know several neo-romantic composers, some early modern sounding composers, some composers incorporating Indian elements in their music. But you know, to all those composers, I think one of the things, you know, I can say something which Ruskin Bond, one of our very fine Indian writers, had said. He said something which is very insightful about the creative process. He said that in order to be a good writer, you have to be a good reader, a voracious reader. And so that's why for composers, you, the, the prerequisite is to just listen to a lot of music and of various kinds, and to perceive the music on an emotional level and at an analytical level at the same time, you know, at different stages depending on what you like. Because the more you listen, the more exposed you will become to what others are doing. And then the larger pool you have to steal from. As
Mm.
Stravinsky said, great composers steal. And that's what I would say is that do not be content with what you have, always explore. And
Mm.
since streaming devices and streaming platforms exist, I can listen to the music of any culture. I can listen to the most obscure composers from Alaska even and can learn from them. And
Mm.
the thing I would say is that always consider music making not only as a process of communication, which it is, but also as a process of learning of
Mm.
how to become a better communicator in the future.
Mm. Okay. All right. Thank you, Utsyo. And this leads to the final question. What's next? What's the future of Utsyo Chakraborty? What is the interesting stuff that you're working on currently? And we're going to be ending in 10 minutes. So,
Oh, sure. I won't be taking too much longer than that. Trust. You know, the thing is, I'm working on a symphony, right? So
oh.
that's fascinating. That's fascinating. I've not written a symphony in 7 years because I sort of grew against the symphonic argument. You know, I listened to Debussy's La Mer, and they were not they were that was not a symphony. They were symphonic sketches, something different. The symphonic argument was sort of contorted. It was not exactly a symphony. So I was very influenced by it. But you know, after writing a lot of other kinds of music, I feel like writing a symphony. So I've been working on that. I have an idea of it being a 5 movement for big orchestra, and it's going to be a major undertaking. But at the same time, I have got some other commissions. I have been asked to write a piece for solo cello, which it's a very interesting challenge for me because I'm not a cellist. And so I have been listening to the Bach suites and the Benjamin Britten suites and a lot of contemporary music for cello. And I have also been asked to write a piece for electronics and for ensemble. And so that's a collaboration I have with German composer Paul Hermanson. And Paul sent me a bunch of electronic materials, and I will be looking at their stuff, the electronic materials that they have processed, and I would have to write a piece of music on top of that. So that's an interesting challenge. So I have a lot going on in the upcoming few months, and lot of undertakings to do, and I look forward to writing good music and sharing them.
That's the end of the interview. Thank you so much, Utsyo, for joining here. Thanks for everyone who's watching this online. Thank you for being a very interactive audience. Thank you so much, Utsyo, and I will be ending the recording.